Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's video where I'm going to go through the question that made me $6.4 million in 2 years without risking a dollar. So pretty crazy set of circumstances actually. And what I want you to walk away with after this video is exactly how simple this was. This was not a complicated outcome. You do have to look at properties and say no to 999 out of 1,000 properties, so that when you do find that one out of 1,000, this is the kind of outcome you can get. It really was down to one question. So let's dive right into it now. So firstly, what I'll cover is the opportunity itself. So how it presented itself and essentially what the property was, the risks that were there, the tenant that was there, the location, I suppose the surrounding information at the market of the market at the time, the property at the time, and why I looked at this opportunity and thought, hey, that's one for me. How I then de-risked the outcome. And what I'm saying there is, how could I imbue such an enormous upside into an asset and de-risk it at the same time? How can you make $6.4 million in 2 years and essentially de-risk it from day one? So I'll show you how I did that. Then it comes down to the actual question itself and how that question created such an enormous uplift. And that's something I teach in my online course. And then the result, it's like, what was the end game here? What actually ended up happening? I'll show you exactly how this came to fruition. So why listen to me? I've got 20 years of commercial property investing experience across every state in Australia. I've got well over $500 million worth of transactions under my belt, from a retail, industrial, office, fast food, childcare, you name it. I've done well over 100 leasing deals in that time. And that's where a lot of the uplift I've been able to generate for my clients and myself has been through really positive leasing deals, really positive tenant interactions. And that's something I cover in my online course as well. And then I'm pretty proud to have generated an average 21% per annum syndicated return. So there's a syndicate business that I'm still running today. And that business, for the assets that we've bought, managed and sold, has generated an average return for investors of over 21% per annum, which is something I'm very proud about. But I'm more proud about the fact that there are countless examples now where we've generated over 100% return per annum, some 200, some 300% per annum, personally and for my private clients, because we've been able to understand risk and articulate an outcome exactly like the one I'm about to show you, where we've actually sat still for a while, we've been patient with our money and waited for the right opportunity to present itself, and then gone all chips in and created a fantastic outcome. I haven't got it on the slide, but the thing I'm most proud about is that I've never lost a dollar across all of that. So in 20 years of commercial property investing experience, I haven't lost $1. So the formula works, and that's the formula I cover in my online course. But let's get into this. So please, if you do like it, subscribe and follow. You can find me at investorcode.com.au, or otherwise, please follow my YouTube channel for more content like this every week. Okay, we're into it now. So the opportunity itself. So this was a core located industrial property in a suburb of Queensland, southeast Queensland, just outside Brisbane. It had fantastic access to arterial roads, networks, links to north and south traffic, to west and east traffic, to airports, to port. So when you look at industrial property, those are some of the things you really want to make sure a property has, is fantastic accessibility to major roads, easy ability to get onto these freeways, these arterial links that allow, in this case, kind of logistics usage to enjoy the features which make it so important. So logistics usage, they want turnaround accessibility or drive around accessibility to the site. And essentially this site came to us in 2019, and it came to us and it was being sold by a person that had about $250 million worth of assets at the time. So a pretty sophisticated property person who had literally just overlooked this extremely simple outcome. And it's a really good example of what I teach in my online course is actually so simple, but everyone thinks it's complicated and it's not. It's just that most people don't do it. And if you do it right, there's enormous value to be to be gained. And this is a great example. So this is a snapshot of exactly what the asset was when we bought it, right? So we bought it for 7.86 million. Now there was an international tenant in place at the time, and they had 6 months left on their term. Now that creates a bit of a headache and a bit of a drama for incoming buyers, because naturally they would look at a premises and go, oh, well, that tenant's pretty well going to leave. Otherwise, why would the seller be selling it? Like if that tenant was going to stay, then why wouldn't the seller just extend the lease and the tenant would stay? So we looked at that after a lot of people had said no to it, and we thought, well, there's got to be something to this. And we looked at the differential between the passing rent and the market rent, and we could see that that was pretty substantial. So what we're saying there is the rent that the tenant was currently paying was about $80,000 a year above what we thought the market should be attributable to that space. Okay, now there was a huge amount of investigation that went into that, and I'll show you that in a few slides' time. But that was the dynamic here, which was a worry, because we not only had a lease that was coming up in 6 months' time, but if that tenant wanted to extend, we thought that that rent would probably come down, which does pretty bad things for the property value. So we looked at that and said, well, we would need to factor that into our purchase price, okay? And we did. We bought this asset at about a 7.4% cap rate on market rent, which was about a 9% cap rate on passing rent, okay? Now the obstacle here, as I've already mentioned, is that it was over rented. Now I've chatted about this a lot in my YouTube videos, but the delta between passing and market rent is always an opportunity. Now that could be a risk that you turn into an opportunity, or it could just be an opportunity from the outset. But whenever there's a differential between passing rent and market rent, my eyes light up. I get very excited about opportunities, and we dive in for me and my clients, because those are where fantastic outcomes can be generated. Obviously, we thought the tenant was likely to vacate because they didn't have an option on the space. And given that this premises was being sold by a sophisticated landlord, you would presume that the tenants already decided to leave, which is why the landlord wants to sell. And as a result of all of those things, it becomes really difficult to finance an asset like this, because the bank looks at that and says, well, I can't really lend you money for a long-term period because there's no income attributable to it. And if you're wanting to get a level of gearing, you need to pay interest, but there's no income coming in from the tenant after the first 6 months. So the bank actually looks at this and they say, well, we need some buffer and reserve to make it workable for us. And so that's where we entertained really great conversations with our banking parties. Look, they believe in our strategy. We've done this thousands of times. So they were willing to jump into to support us on this strategy that we had for this asset, and it came off. But what I'm saying is that the initial conversations were pretty difficult ones from a financier. And I've written down the bottom here, the seller was a private who owns over $250 million of commercial property in his own name at the time of selling this. So what we're saying is that there was a sophisticated landlord that left all this money on the table. So we bought it in February 2019 and we sold it in May 2021. And I'll show you the sale result as we get to the end of this YouTube video, okay? Okay, so the first thing we wanted to do is de-risk the outcome. Now, I've told you that before, opportunities are great, but if you need to risk the farm in order to get them, and then that farm or your house or whatever it is at risk the entire time, well, in my mind, that's not workable. So I'm always looking for opportunities where there's asymmetric upside, so huge upside that I can de-risk before I have to risk my own capital. So I can actually de-risk the cost or the likely things I'm going to have to do to bring about that upside. I can de-risk it from day one. So the entire due diligence here was really about understanding this. Now I say that because, as I mentioned at the start, we knew this property was in a core location. We knew there was a demand for tenants to be in that location because there was a very low vacancy rate in the area. It was very well located. The premises was actually purpose-built for this tenant, okay, which is interesting. So this tenant obviously has a particular set of requirements, and the landlord at the time said, hey, what are those requirements? I'll build you a premises exactly to those specifications. Now, when you hear that as an incoming buyer, that's music to my ears, because I'm thinking, why would the tenant want to leave if this has been built for them? They've either outgrown the space or they're shrinking. And if they're shrinking, is it a kind of business we want to be backing? And if they're outgrowing the space, well, now I need to worry about, how am I going to release it? But in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, ooh, this tenant wants to vacate. Maybe I can find a new premises for them if I know what their mandate is. So can you see how just, having conversations and really understanding this property intimately, even if this opportunity hadn't come off, it may have created another opportunity to move this tenant to a different location. But the entire due diligence here, after understanding the property, the core location, the core market fundamentals, the low vacancy rate, the cap rate was very, very stable at that point in time in 2019. Interest rates were like 0.1%. So there was a huge amount of certainty in the environment, which is really good for buying. Really what the due diligence came down to was understanding the vacancy risk. So what's another way of saying that? How could we understand the risk of the tenant vacating? And then how could we quantify that risk? And that's where my feasibility and my modeling and my spreadsheets, that's what they do. They take all the inputs and the information you have, you put them into the spreadsheet, and it will give you a numerical quantification of the risk and the reward, okay? So in order to quantify that risk, all we had to do was understand the market as good or better than the tenant. Now, if you think about that for a minute, what are we saying? We're saying that property people, and I'm a property person, I love investing in property, all I needed to do was know the market better than the tenant. And if I knew the market better than the tenant, I should be able to understand where the tenant could go if they wanted alternate premises. I should be able to understand the properties that were currently available or becoming available for that tenant in the next 6 to 12 months. I should then also understand what rent is being asked for those tenants. I should also understand what incentives might be being offered for those tenants or for those premises, if there are any. And then importantly, I need to be very aware of what are the other comparable leasing transactions that have happened in comparable areas, which would allow me a little bit of a guide as to how to have conversations with this tenant around about rent, incentives, lease term, and some other very minor lease terms like your escalations and your market rent reviews, okay? So I'm not saying that I had to understand this property better than anyone else in the market. I'm just saying you needed to understand the market better than the tenant, okay? That's a really interesting way of approaching this. So we wanted to assess the leasing transactions across all comparable properties. And we did that. We looked at, it was a very low vacancy rate in the area, okay? So we looked at 12 recent comparable transactions in the last 12 months. And we looked at whether they were inferior or superior to the premises that we were looking to buy, or comparable, what key features they had. So for instance, in industrial property, they may have had slightly higher warehousing components to office, or they might have had slightly better hard stand, or they might have had slightly higher roof or a slightly lower roof, or they might have had no drive around accessibility. So those are like the features that we know industrial users want. And I cover all that in my online course, literally the things that industrial users want. But once we knew what they wanted, then we're literally ranking our property. We're going, okay, well, it's more superior than that one, and that one leased for $120 a square meter. Okay, it's not as good as that one, and that one leased for $150 a square meter. And we're making these determinations during our due diligence period. And we did that with 12 comparable transactions that all happened in the last 12 months that were the only leasing transactions that had happened in that 12 months. So what does that mean? That means that we, as an incoming buyer, were across every single leasing transaction that had happened in comparable premises, which gave us the market evidence we needed to know exactly what other tenants are paying in rent, exactly what incentives are being offered, exactly what other landlords are doing and using to attract tenants in terms of incentives or in terms of capex, in terms of fit out, in terms of the quality of the premises, and we'll know exactly how long those premises sat vacant, if anything. So if we know that, which we did, and that's the example of a really good due diligence, we knew every single transaction that had happened, then we back ourselves to know the market better than the tenant. Then we could step into conversations with the tenant and go, hey, we offer you X or we think Y. All right. In order to do that, we focused on rent. So what were comparable properties renting for? And if they were inferior, were they renting for a higher rental or a lower rental? Downtime is really important. So were they, once a premises is vacant, does it sit on the market for 3 months before a new tenant moves in, or 6 months, or 12 months, or 24 months? So if we were in the office market, that might have been 24 months, but we were in the industrial market with a very low vacancy rate. So we were looking at it thinking there's about a 6-month downtime, which means that from the time you put up a billboard for lease, there's a 6-month period before the tenant's paying rent, okay? Or the tenant's committed to a lease. Then we wanted to understand incentives, as in is the landlord giving 5% incentives, 10% incentives, 30% incentives, or 50% incentives? Or is the landlords in these 12 transactions just saying, that's no incentive. You take the premises as it is, here's the rent, no incentive. And then we also wanted to understand CapEx, like what are landlords doing to entice tenants to their premises as opposed to a competing premises down the road. Guys, that is so easily done, it's unbelievable. And you know what? We did it with our own hands. We went and literally scoured every single comparable transaction. I chatted to every agent that had done a transaction in this area in the 24 months prior. I chatted to the best leasing agents. I chatted to the best sales agents. I chatted to valuers. Valuers gave me so much information that I never would have got purely from a phone call to a valuer. And they helped me in enormous ways to come up and say, Cal, I think your market rent is about this, and I think incentives are about this based on what I'm seeing, okay? So a few conversations with agents of leasing, sales agents, and valuers gave me a huge amount of information, right? Then step 2 was once I've quantified that risk, I then want to build that risk and conservatism into my buying price. So what am I saying there? I'm essentially saying, okay, if I'm going to buy a premises, I'm risking capital to buy it. How much capital am I risking? But if the worst case scenario were to happen, could I still afford to buy this asset and make a profit? And that question is really important, okay? So rather than just buying a property and hoping for the best, why don't we use the quantified risk in step 1 and then build that into the model for step 2, okay? And this is exactly what we did. I looked at downtime, incentive, leasing fees, and they came up with a total cost. Now, there's some things that I didn't focus on here. I didn't focus on CapEx because during our investigations, we figured out that this premises was the best, some of the best premises available for lease in the area, and that it was incredibly high spec. It had been purpose built for the tenant about 12 years prior, had a really high spec, and so we didn't need to spend on CapEx. We knew that this premises was actually superior to a lot of other comparables in the area. So I focused on the downtime, the incentive, and the leasing fees. Now the rent I didn't need to focus on, and that's because the 12 comparable transactions in the past 12 months were all within $5 to $10 a square meter, which means that the rent was really not a question. Like it was very obvious what we were going to achieve in rental, okay? So that's why I'm saying when I was looking at my likely and my worst case scenarios, rental wasn't one that was going to sway either way. It was pretty obvious what the rent was going to be. And leasing fees in this case, as you can see, were actually pretty obvious they were going to be $110,000 in each case. But the downtime and the incentive is interesting. So when we looked at the comparable transactions, we saw that there were some transactions that were happening in 3 months, as in the downtime was 3 months. Some of them were happening in 12 months and 1 or 2 of them were 15 months, but most of them were 3 to 6 months. So we looked at a likely scenario of buying a property, and if we lost the tenant, we would have to factor in 6 months downtime. So that means 6 months of not receiving rent, but also paying outgoings, okay? Because you still got to pay land tax, you still got to pay council rates, you still got to pay water charges, still got to pay cleaning of the premises, you still got to pay security and insurance. So there's still outlays during those 6 months and you're not receiving rent, okay? So we looked at a likely scenario and we said, well, if we can quantify that at about 6 months, what would a worst case scenario look like? And we thought, well, if things went really badly and we sat on the market vacant for 12 months, what would the cost of that be? And it ended up about $680,000. And obviously half of that was 6 months, which is the more likely scenario. Then we went to incentives and we looked at the 12 comparable transactions in the past 12 months, and we said, look, those incentives range from about 5% to 10%. There was one or two that were above 10%. So we looked at that and we took an average, and there was an 8% average, which means that landlords were offering 8% of the value of the lease in incentive to the tenant to induce tenants to take occupancy in their premises. Now, 8% was the average across the 12 comparables. So that's our likely scenario, and we quantified that at $230,700. And then we thought, well, what's the worst case scenario? And the worst transaction we'd seen for an inferior premises, so worse premises in a slightly worse location with slightly worse accessibility, lower ceilings, not as good a hard stand, not purpose built, 25 years old rather than 12 years old, like a whole bunch of things that it means it was inferior to ours. It took a 12% incentive to attract a tenant. So we looked at that and we thought, well, that's probably our worst case scenario here. Like, we got to hope to get 8%. What happens if it's worst case scenario? It's a 12%. Then we looked at our leasing fees and we thought, well, based on the rent, which we knew was $120 a square meter, it's going to cost us $110,000 in leasing fee, which is a 15% commission on an assumed 5-year lease term. Okay, so that's $120 a square meter based over the square meterage of the site, times by 5 years, and then times by 15%, and you get your leasing fees. Okay, and we thought that kind of either way here, we're going to have to pay the full leasing fee. Like, even if it takes us longer to lease it, we're probably still going to have to pay the full leasing fee. So we thought this would be comparable in both cases, the likely and the worst case scenario. And then all we did was we accumulated those costs. And in the likely scenario, they came to an accumulated amount of $682,700. And in the worst case scenario, it came to 1.14 million. So that's really important, because what that essentially means is that step one was quantifying the risk, okay, which is essentially this likely scenario on the left-hand side here. But step two is, why don't we build conservatism in such that even if things go wrong, right, even if the worst case scenario happens, we can still come out making money. So then what we did is we looked at that 1.14 million you can see here, right? The 1.14 million you can see, and we baked that into our cost structure. And we said, well, based on the assumed market value once we had done a leasing deal, right? Would we still make money based on the price of the asset that we're buying, the costs it takes to buy the asset, and this presumed worst case scenario costs of filling the vacancy and leasing it up, okay? And as you can see, that comes down to another couple of assumptions here, which is the market value on exit, which is essentially saying, well, if we had a comparable leasing transaction to the other 12 leasing transactions, and we had a 5-year lease to a decent tenant at $120 a square meter, what would the likely value be? And as I said, at this time, 2019, there was a very stable market. So there was a lot of extremely similar evidence, which meant that the valuers could give us a huge amount of certainty that it was going to be about a 6.5% cap rate, which would produce a value of 9.6 million in the likely scenario, or 9.2 million in the worst case scenario. Okay, so that's really interesting. What we've done there is we take you to the numbers, and we've gone, okay, let's factor in, let's work backwards. So we're going $7.86 million purchase price. Then we've got to add on our costs. Now, those costs are technical due diligence, a valuer or evaluation that you might need, legal costs, settlement costs, but a huge part of that is actually stamp duty, which you're paying to the government, okay? Then we're adding in our leasing buffer now. Now, that leasing buffer is the $1.14 million in the worst case scenario. Let's assume that all of it is a cost, even though it might not need to be a cost. Let's assume all of it is a cost, okay? And it came to 9.487 million. And we thought, geez, that's essentially what we're saying is, if we buy this asset and the worst case scenario happens, we need to be making at least $9.487 million out of selling this asset or revaluing this asset in the worst case scenario, okay? Then what we do is we use that and we plug it into our feasibility. And this is where it gets really interesting. because all the feasibility here was based on $120 a square meter, because I've told you already, but the valuation advice and all the comparables we saw were extremely similar. So we knew with a huge degree of certainty that we were not going to receive a rental lower than $120 a square meter, okay? Which produced a $580,000 per year in net rental, okay? Then what we did is we look at the likely and the worst case results. So we use the same numbers before. We go, okay, well, the capital value on exit from the table prior was 9.6 million. And what happens if our total cost happens? So the worst case scenario in terms of cost, but the likely scenario in terms of sale, we're at $9.6 million money in the door and $9.487 million out the door, which means essentially is $113,000 of profit from taking on the risk of a 6-month tenure and then releasing the asset. Now let's look at the worst case scenario. We said, okay, well, the capital value might only be $9.2 million, all right? And we've got a total cost base of 9.487 because we've used the full leasing buffer in there, 1.14 million. That would actually produce a $287,000 loss by taking on this exercise, okay? So as our feasibility started telling us the numbers here, and we looked at this and we said, well, obviously, you know, being property people, we like to back ourselves in to create outcomes that are better than the market. But when you're looking at these numbers, you got to have your eyes wide open and go, well, potentially, if we get this wrong, and this takes in the worst case scenario comes off here, we're actually going to be down by $287,000. But there's one thing that we hadn't accounted for, and that's the fact that we're actually going to enjoy 6 months worth of rental. Now there was $580,000 worth of rent being paid per year in net rental, okay, which is $290,000 a year, $90,000 for half the year, which essentially means that our worst case scenario here was assuming that we got 12 months downtime, okay, 12 months to lease the premises. We leased it at $120 a square meter. We had to pay a 12% incentive to induce the tenant. We got $120 a square meter. We had to pay a 15% leasing commission. And we incurred $680,000 of downtime in lost rental and outgoings for the premises, right? Which was $1.14 million. But we didn't account for the fact that we're actually going to enjoy 6 months worth of income. And that 6 months worth of income, $290,000, literally puts us smack bang into $3,000 worth of profit in the worst case scenario. So what I'm saying here is we took a worst case scenario in our feasibility and we could still make $1 from taking on the risk. So naturally, that's a really great position to be in because we factored in the worst case scenario, like Armageddon scenario here, and we can still make $1 out of this, which means that if we do better than that, we're making money. So what's next? We figured out that if we could get $125 a square meter in net rental, we would make a profit in the worst case scenario on both counts without factoring in the 6 month worth of rental tail or the income that we were going to enjoy for the first 6 months. So $5 per square meter difference in the rental immediately kicked us into profit. So we did a sensitivity analysis here and we started looking, well, what happens if we can get 130? What happens if we can get 135? What happens if we can increase our incentive to the tenant and get 140? And all these things started working around in the background, but they're all outcomes that we hope to achieve to make a better financial result. But the whole time we knew what was our downside, what was our worst case scenario, okay? Then what we did is we obviously contracted the property, and during our due diligence, we did everything I've just shown you in the last 2 slides. So we knew going in that we had more information than the tenant because we had looked at every single leasing transaction that had happened in the last 12 months. Now, that wasn't difficult to do. We asked valuers, we asked leasing agents, multiple leasing agents, we asked sales agents, and we had conversations, and that's all it was. We said, hey, can you send me the information that you did for that lease over there? Can you send me that information from that lease over there? That lease was an interesting one. How long did that take to happen? Can you please send me that information? And all we did is we took all that information and plugged it into my feasibility. And it spat out the answers I've just shown you. So we knew that the downside was calculable. And then we went in with a conservative mindset saying anything from $120 a square meter above, we were going to be in profit. If we made $125 a square meter, we're in profit from day one. Then we asked the one question, because the one thing we haven't mentioned here is that there was still a tenant in place, and no one had chatted to this tenant yet about what they actually wanted. So we asked literally this one question: are these premises suited to your current and future business needs? And if not, is there anything that I, as the landlord, can do to make this property amazing for your continued tenure? You would not believe the response that you get from tenants when you ask that question, because most of the time, tenants have an adversarial relationship with landlords. They hate the landlord. That's the landlord always taking my money. I want the aircon fixed. He never fixes it. I've asked for that leaking tap to be done, and I can't get them to add on site. And he's always at me about this. And so there's usually this really adversarial relationship between landlords and tenants. And I think that that is a crock of shit. We try and foster fantastic relationships with our tenants and create win-win outcomes wherever we can, doing things like this. We got immediately in front of the tenant and we said, look, we asked this question. And interestingly, the site manager said, yeah, we can't afford to go anywhere. Over 80% of our employee base lives within a 10-minute drive of this premises. That's the first thing. It's been purpose-built for us is the second thing. And we've been trying to extend our lease, but the landlord won't respond. So I'm sitting there going, wow, that is just a remarkable set of circumstances. So I said, are you the decision maker? Like, can you actually make the decision to extend the lease? And he said, no, unfortunately we can't. It has to go through head office. So I said, where's head office? Melbourne, here's the number, call the guy. I called up the guy and I said, look, we're the incoming landlord now. So I need to be really honest. We're not the landlord yet, but we are likely to be the landlord for this premises. And if we are, we would love to keep you as a tenant. But I want to know, is the premises currently suited to your needs? And he said, look, Cal, I've got to be honest. It works for us. We are looking at alternate premises. But the thing that's most frustrating to us is that because the gravel, the hard stand at the back of the premises is gravel, every time our trucks turn around, it kicks up all this dust, and all the dust flies into the warehouse and covers all of our machinery in dust. And it's actually deteriorating the life cycle of our machinery. And I said, okay, well, if I could fix that problem for you, would you take a long-term tenure? And he said, absolutely. He said, look, the last thing we want to do is leave. We've got a lot of our workforce and our employee base actually live really close to the site. So the last thing we want to do is leave, but we're kind of forced to because the landlord is not responding to us. So I said, okay, well, I'll tell you what, I'll fix that problem for you. I'll put down beautiful hard stand for you, 2,000 square meters of gorgeous high grade hard stand if you'll take a 10-year lease. And he said, look, Cal, we probably don't want to go above 5 years. And I said, well, look, 5 years is okay for us, but in order to get you to 10, is there anything I can do in terms of incentive? And he said, yep, a 10% incentive would get us over the line. So that is so interesting that this one question has created this enormous value uplift. Okay, and I'll show you what that looks like now. But the more interesting part is that it aligned the interests of the tenant and the landlord. So we're creating a win-win outcome, which I continue to educate people on and continue to promote, because it is the most amazing way of doing deals. So what was the result? We bought the asset for $7.86 million and we sold it for $14.3 million 2 years later. Okay. Now, interestingly, you'll see that the rent here was $661,000 a square meter, $661,000 a year. And the market rent at the time was $580. Now I showed you that in the feasibility. We were presuming to get a rental of $580, which is $120 a square meter. So how did we end up getting $140 a square meter? Well, that additional hard stand that we gave to the tenant, we rentalized it at $25 a square meter, which means that we essentially gave the tenant a reduction in their rental over the warehousing and office section, but we got an increase on the rental of the hard stand that we were laying down for them. Now, that did cost us $300,000, but that's fine because we made a $6 million uplift. And that $300,000 of the cost was embedded in the 10% return, the 10% incentive that we offered the tenant to take a 10-year lease instead of a 5-year lease. Now, what did that do? Well, it drastically reduced the cap rate to 4.75%. Now, we were presuming to have a cap rate of about 6.5%, but because we had increased the rent, improved the building as well, because now it's got higher quality hard stand, and we had imbued the site with 10 years worth of secure leasing income to an international tenant in a core location, it compressed the cap rate by almost 200 bips. And what they did was it catapulted the value to 14.3 million, which created a $6.4 million gross uplift. But obviously there were some costs on the way in and costs on the way through getting that leasing deal done. So what did that produce in terms of net? Well, it produced a $4.6 million net profit in 2 years. So what am I saying here, guys? I'm saying that if we could do, and this is what I do all the time, I go and defend the outcome I want with the most conservative approach possible, use my feasibility and my numbers to show me what the worst outcome is, and then go ahead and start having conversations with the tenant to try and create the best outcome. And anywhere in between there is profit. But if I know that I can walk into a site and the worst case scenario is still going to make me money, well then where's my risk? So with that being said, guys, I have covered the opportunity. I've covered the fact that this doesn't come around every day. You need to be willing to say no to 999 out of 1,000 properties. And I show you exactly how to do that in my online course and how to get bang for your buck there. Like, you don't want to be spending 80 hours a week scrolling through, realcommercial.com. There's actually really clever ways of doing that and waiting for the right opportunity to come. Then I showed you exactly how I de-risked the outcome. And I showed you how I've taken a likely result and then the worst case scenario, and then embedded the worst case scenario into my feasibility to make sure that it was de-risked from day one, even if the tenant left. And then I showed you the one question I asked the tenant to create this enormous upside, and how to do that in a really clever way to create a win-win outcome with the tenant, the landlord, and ultimately the site itself and the incoming buyer. And the result, which was a $4.6 million net uplift or a $6.4 million gross uplift. So guys, there is a formula for this. I focus on 3 key actions that drive enormous value, and I've just covered one of those in this video. It's how to have fantastic conversations with your tenant. I show you how to get properties and opportunities which allow you to take those 3 key actions, and then I teach you the essential things, not all the things, just the essential things you need to know, and exactly what to do to secure the opportunities and de-risk them before you buy them. I cover all that in my online course. So if you'd like to take your first steps or maybe a second step in commercial property investing, please find me online at investorcode.com.au or reach out. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to see you next week.